negotiations are headed nowhere. This is all just, theater. It's all designed to win the battle of public opinion. The fact is the Russians and the Ukrainians cannot agree on the terms of a deal that will shut this war down. And this war is going to be settled on the battlefield. The idea that both sides are going to produce a memorandum, they're going to exchange those memorandums, and then you're going to be able to carve out a meaningful agreement based on the two memoranda is a pipe dream. It's just not going to happen.
And now I want to take one other look at something else Lavrov said also earlier today. Was he addressed something that Zelensky has said many times, in that Zelensky wants, and Europeans have all been adamant, there will be a 30-day unconditional ceasefire first. And so many Western and American pundits keep saying, obviously, I mean, how can you have a negotiated settlement if you don't first stop the fighting? It has to be that way. Tammy Bruce from the podium in the State Department said that a week or two ago. But Lavrov today, in very clear language, seemed to say, niet.
You're putting the cart before the horse. First, we need to have a treaty, and once it is agreed upon, then we'll decide. But President Zelensky, as President Putin has repeatedly stated, lacks legitimacy. This is acknowledged even within Ukraine. Therefore, when the treaty is ready, and it is far from certain that this will happen tomorrow, it must be structured in a way that prevents a repeat of what the 2014 coup plotters, who came to power through a bloody coup, did. Only then will we see who among the Ukrainian authorities possesses legitimacy.
So now the roadblocks are mounting and getting bigger. Not only is he saying absolutely categorically, no, it doesn't matter what you guys want, there won't be a ceasefire first, period, under any conditions. And separately, who's going to sign them? Because we're saying maybe it's not going to be Zelensky. And he went on there to talk about maybe they need to have elections. I don't know. Maybe it could be the Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada. We don't know. But all this makes it virtually impossible that Zelensky can operate into these. I mean, he would, if he's going to submit to that and say, yes, we'll have elections, or yes, it'll be someone else signing, then he loses legitimacy in his own country's eyes, not anybody else. So what does this tell you about where things are going?
Well, let's just focus on the ceasefire. You implied, Danny, that what Lavrov is saying is something new. The Russians have said ad nauseum for well over a year now that they will not accept a ceasefire before the terms of a deal are agreed upon by both sides. They have said this over and over, yet Zelensky and the Europeans and even the Americans continue to insist on having a ceasefire before you reach an agreement. The Russians have said categorically that's not going to happen. This is Lavrov saying that again. Second point is, the Russians would be nuts to agree to a ceasefire. The Russians are winning on the battlefield. A ceasefire would simply give the Ukrainians an opportunity to regroup and put up stiffer resistance against the Russians. Why in God's name would the Russians accept such a proposal? The answer is they won't. And this is why they keep saying ad nauseum, there's not going to be any ceasefire before there's an agreement on the basic terms of a peace settlement. So that's where we are. And this kind of nonsense just goes on and on and on. And I guess, this matters because public opinion matters. But for me, what really counts is what happens on the battlefield. And if you look at what's happening on the battlefield and what's likely to happen as we move forward, is that the Russians are going to win the war. And again, that's why they're not going to agree to a ceasefire.
By the way, we had a remarkable and illuminating interview on the show yesterday. For the first time, we had an American who was fighting on the side of the Russians as a drone pilot, and he's been there for 18 months. So he's got quite a bit of combat experience under his belt and is very tied into one of the current lines. He wouldn't tell us exactly where he was fighting. He was talking in a separate place for the interview. But a couple of things he said that were really illuminating. Number one is he said that the Russians have no problems with personnel to the extent that they allow their troops 30 days leave per year to go home, to do whatever they want to do. They will rotate units off periodically so they never get worn out, because he talked about how important that was, of course. But the fact is they have the manpower to do it. They have a system to do it, so their troops stay fresh all the time. While on the other side of the line, as you know very well, there's not many, don't ever get any rotation off, and the people who get up to the front die very shortly, especially the new guys who are being basically press ganged off the streets throughout Ukraine. And that alone tells you that there is just no rational prospect that the two armies, which are already quantitatively and qualitatively out of balance in Russia's favor, is ever going to slow down, or much less stop or reverse this Russian offensive.
I think there's no question about it. I would guess that the Russians, who are raising somewhere between 30 and 40,000 troops every month, and have been raising significant numbers of troops for the past 2 years, have probably about 700,000 troops engaged inside of Ukraine. And I would bet if you looked at Ukrainian forces, combat forces, at the very most, they have 250,000.
Wow.
My guess is that the Russians have probably about a 2-to-1 advantage in manpower. And as you pointed out, the Russians are training their forces, and they're giving them R&R, or leaves of absence. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are sending untrained individuals to the front lines. They get hardly any R&R at all unless they get wounded, and they're being worn down. And all of this is happening, Danny, at the same time the United States is slowly but steadily divorcing itself from Ukraine. Trump has made it clear that he is not Biden II. He's not going to go back to Congress and get the necessary funding for another pipeline's worth of weaponry for the Ukrainians. And the Europeans certainly can't make that up in any meaningful way. All of this tells you that the Ukrainians are doomed. And why people don't recognize that and begin to work for some sort of settlement now befuddles me, and I know it befuddles you as well.
Well, in fact, you brought that up. I want to jump to a soundbite that we have actually from Marco Rubio, who addressed the very issue you raised there about what we even are thinking about giving to Ukraine.
Is the president, and are you prepared to pass another supplemental bill to support them?
Well, that's a different decision. That's a different question. That's not up for me to decide. The White House would have to make a determination about whether to come to Congress for a supplemental. But everything that's been approved and congressionally appropriated is ongoing. In fact, to the extent that the Ukrainians have asked for anything additional, what they've asked for is air defenses, Patriot units, which frankly we don't have. But we are working closely with our NATO allies. There are NATO allies that do have some batteries of Patriot missiles that they could provide or transfer over to the Ukrainians to defend, for example, the airspace of Kyiv and other places. And we've been encouraging in that front and working alongside our partners there to get deliveries of some of these systems. As you can imagine, none of these countries want to give up their Patriot systems either.
Now, I want to talk in a second about his comment that, we don't even have anything on the books, not even going to ask for any more. So once that $61 billion from last May runs out, that's all she wrote for anything coming from the United States. But that last line he mentioned there is, I think, a big reveal that I haven't seen hardly anybody talk about. We're not giving them any more of our Patriot systems because we don't have them. So we have tapped out of any kind of excess, and God only knows how far below minimum we actually have gone, and neither does anybody else in the West. So that right there tells you we have depleted our stocks of things that we may need to defend ourselves one day, and we sure aren't going to have what to give them to Ukraine anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, Macron has recently made a statement where he said, in effect, that the cupboard is bare. The idea that the Europeans are going to compensate for what we no longer are willing to do is not a serious argument. And there are limits to what we can do, even if we stay in the fight. You want to remember the Russians were winning when Joe Biden was in charge, and Biden was working hard with the Europeans to keep the Ukrainians in the fight. But basically, we're pulling out. We're going to greatly reduce our commitment to Ukraine. It's hard to say exactly what it will look like. But given that fact, and given the fact that the Russians are producing massive numbers of artillery tubes and tanks and drones and so forth and so on, they have a heavy-duty, serious manufacturing base, which we don't have and the Europeans have. So in terms of equipment, the Russians are going to have a great advantage over the Ukrainians. And we talked about the manpower situation before. The population of Russia is much larger, probably in the range of 4 to 5 to 1, bigger than the Ukrainian population. And that tells you that the size of the two militaries is going to favor the Russians at almost every turn, which the numbers seem to indicate is the case at this point in time. All of this is to say the Ukrainians are screwed.